They ask me sometimes, the young ones who still have that shine in their eyes, what the difference is between orders and faith. I tell them there isn't one. Not really. Not when you've been in the guard long enough. But that's a lie. I know it's a lie because I learned the difference on Hadris Tertius, in the grinding horror of the Kessock siege, when Commissar Vrel gave his last order, and I understood, finally, that some victories are worse than any defeat the Emperor's enemies could deliver. The sound that haunts me isn't screaming. Any guard veteran can handle screaming. We make our peace with it, or we eat our sidearms in the latrine. What I hear, even now, 30 years later, in this quiet administratum posting where they sent me to finish my service, is the Vox click. That particular triple pulse signal that meant Commissariat override, priority alpha. I must have heard it 1,000 times before Hadris Tertius. After, I heard it 10,000 more. But every time, every single time, I'm back in that trench, listening to Vrel's voice coming through static and ashfall. And I know what's coming, and I cannot stop it, and I would not stop it even if I could. Because that's what we were made for. I should start earlier. The Departamento Munitorum appreciates chronological precision in after-action reports, even ones filed 3 decades past deadline, even ones nobody will ever read, because the relevant officers are long dead and the campaign itself has been officially amended so many times. The truth is buried under layers of administrative correction, like a body under Hive City, ruins. So, Hadris Tertius, year 962, M41 by the calendar. Though we'd lost track of actual dates in the siege, the planet was nothing special, a minor forge shrine producing ammunition and small arms components for the subsector fleet. The orcs who wanted it were nothing special either. Typical greenskin warg, more enthusiasm than strategy. What made Hadris Tertius matter was timing and geography. We held it, barely, and if we lost it, the entire Kessock line would collapse, and 7 systems would fall before reinforcements could arrive. The 44th Validian Infantry had been on Hadris Tertius for 8 months when Commissar Vrel arrived. 8 months of trench warfare, counter-attacks, artillery exchanges, the kind of grinding attrition that turns soldiers into machines and machines into junk. We'd lost our original Commissar in month 3, a headshot from an orc sniper who got lucky, and the replacement lasted 6 weeks before a shell took him and half of 2nd Platoon. After that we went 4 months without commissariat oversight, which sounds like freedom but isn't. A guard regiment without a commissar is a body without a spine. We held our positions because we were Validian and we knew our duty, but the cohesion was fraying. Minor infractions went unpunished. Soldiers questioned orders, not openly, but in that dangerous quiet way that spreads like rot. Desertions started, just a few at first, men slipping away into the Hive ruins during bombardments, but enough that Lieutenant Cora started conducting dawn headcounts, with that look in his eyes that said he was calculating how long before the desertion rate made our defensive line untenable. Vrel came down in a Valkyrie through orc anti-air fire that should have shredded the transport, and he walked out of the gunship without his greatcoat, even disturbed by the explosions still blooming in the sky above us. That was the first thing I noticed about him. Not his face, which was ordinary enough, scarred and weathered like any veteran. Not his uniform, which was regulation commissariat black and red. The stillness. He moved through the war like it wasn't there, like the shells and the smoke and the screaming were happening in some other dimension that couldn't touch him. I'd seen fearless men before. Fearless men die quickly or they become heroes, and both categories end up decorating the same mass graves. Vrel wasn't fearless. He was something else. He was certain. The first execution happened within 12 hours of his arrival. Private Hess, a loader in our mortar crew, had been caught hoarding ration packs, not for himself, we learned later, but to trade with the local survivors, still clinging to life in the Hive ruins for information about orc movement patterns. Entrepreneurial initiative, maybe, but also fraternization with civilians in a war zone. Also black market trading of Imperial supplies. Under our previous commissars, it might have been a flogging and reassignment to punishment detail. Vrel called formation, made Hess kneel in the mud of the parade ground while we assembled in the cold rain that fell constantly on Hadris Tertius, and shot him once through the back of the head with that bolt pistol every commissar carries. The sound was different than I expected. Crisper. I'd heard bolt weapons before, of course, heard them so much they were background noise, but this was different, close, intimate, the pressure wave washing over us in the front ranks, and in the silence after, while Hess's blood made new patterns in the mud, Vrel spoke for the first time to us as a regiment. His voice was quiet, conversational almost, but it carried perfectly in that strange acoustics way some men have. He said Hess died a soldier of the Imperium, which was mercy, and that he hoped Hess's soul would find its way to the Emperor's light despite his failings. He said we were all going to die on Hadris Tertius. Probably, because the strategic projections gave us a 43% chance of holding the Forge Shrine until relief arrived, and that meant better than half of us would be corpses or pieces of corpses by campaign's end. He said this wasn't a tragedy, it was mathematics, and the Emperor's Imperium ran on mathematics as much as faith. Then he said any man who wanted to desert should do it now. Step forward, take the bolt round, and die with his name recorded in the regimental rolls, instead of rotting anonymously in the ruins with the rats and the orcs. Nobody moved. We weren't brave, necessarily. We were confused, and confused soldiers stay still. But Vrel nodded like he'd won some kind of bet with himself, dismissed us, and went to inspect the defensive positions personally, walking the trench lines in his commissar's coat, while orc snipers took shots at him and missed, or he didn't notice, or it didn't matter. By nightfall he'd reorganized our duty rotations, executed 2 more men for dereliction, and implemented a new Vox discipline protocol that cut our communication frequency usage by 30%. By the end of the first week, the 44th Validian had stopped fraying. We were a weapon again, sharp and terrible, and pointed at the enemy. I should say something here about Vrel's eyes, because everyone who served under him remembers his eyes. They were grey, the colour of Hadris Tertius's perpetual overcast, and they had this quality of attention that made you feel like the only person in the universe when they fixed on you. Not in a kind way. Like you were a mechanism he was evaluating for function and flaw, like he could see exactly how you would break and was calculating whether to prevent it or accelerate it, depending on what served the Emperor's purpose best. I came under those eyes 3 times during the siege. The first was during a routine inspection when he asked me, Corporal Thane, veteran of 6 campaigns, how many men I'd killed personally. Not approximately. Exactly. I told him I didn't keep count. He said I should start, because that number was the only honest measurement of my value to the Imperium, and walked on. The second time was after I led a successful raid on an orc supply depot and brought back ammunition we desperately needed. He nodded once, said, adequate, and assigned me to training detail to teach the new replacements how I'd done it. The third time was during the last order, and by then his eyes had changed in a way I still cannot adequately describe to anyone who wasn't there. The siege settled into its rhythm after Vrel arrived. That terrible grinding rhythm siege warfare has where days blur into each other, and you mark time by casualties and shell counts instead of calendars. The orcs would mass for an assault every week or so, throw themselves at our positions with that cheerful enthusiasm they have for dying, and we'd kill them by the hundreds until they withdrew to regroup, and we'd repair the breaches and bury our dead and wait for the next one. In between, artillery exchanges, sniper duels, patrol actions, raids, counter-raids, all the small violences that fill the spaces between major battles. We lost men steadily, 1s and 2s and sometimes whole squads when something went badly wrong. But the line held. The Forge Shrine kept producing, kept feeding ammunition to the fleet, and that was all that mattered. We were mathematics, like Vrel said, input and output, blood and bullets. I learned things about Vrel in those months, fragments assembled from observation and rumor, and the strange intimacy soldiers develop with the men who can kill them legally. He'd been Commissar for 4 different regiments before ours, all of them noted in his record for high discipline and high casualty rates. He never slept more than 2 hours at a time, but nobody ever saw him tired. He read from the Imperial infantryman's uplifting primer constantly, but not like it was a manual, like it was poetry he was memorizing. And he had this habit, noticed first by Sergeant Voss, who had trench duty near the command bunker, of standing alone in the fire step during bombardments, with his head tilted like he was listening to something under the explosions, something the rest of us couldn't hear. When Voss mentioned this, carefully, in the way you mention strange behavior by a commissar when you don't want to get shot for insubordination, Vrel apparently smiled and said he was listening to the Emperor's will making itself known through the probabilities of trajectory and blast radius. Voss decided not to ask follow-up questions. The Vox signal changed meaning for me on day 182 of the siege, which I remember because it was the day Lieutenant Cora died, and I inherited command of 3rd Platoon by virtue of being the highest-ranking survivor. The Orcs had launched a major push, bigger than usual, and broken through on the southern sector. We'd contained it, barely, pushed them back, with massed lasfire and artillery support, and the kind of desperate fighting where you stop thinking and just kill until there's nothing left to kill or you're dead. Cora took a chopper to the chest during the fighting, died cursing the Orcs and the Emperor in equal measure, which I pretended not to hear because a commissar might have made an example of it, and Cora was a good officer who'd kept more men alive than he'd gotten killed. In the aftermath, covered in blood that was mostly not mine, I heard the Vox click, triple pulse, commissariat override, priority alpha, and Vrel's voice, calm as morning prayers, telling all unit commanders to report casualty figures and ammunition expenditure to the command bunker within the hour. That's when I learned we were losing. Not tactically, not in any obvious way you could see from the trenches, but strategically, mathematically, in the way that mattered to the Lord Commander and the fleet admirals and whoever else made decisions at levels we couldn't comprehend. The Orcs were getting reinforcements faster than our projections predicted. Our ammunition expenditure was exceeding resupply capacity. The forge shrine itself was damaged, production down 18%, and the Mechanicus tech priests had given up praying to the machine god for increased output and started praying for basic functionality. We could hold the current positions for maybe another month. After that, the numbers said we'd collapse not from being overrun but from simple mathematics. Not enough bullets, not enough men, not enough anything. Vrel explained this to the officer cadre in that bunker meeting with the same conversational tone he used for everything. We were sitting on ammunition crates and broken furniture, breathing air that smelled like promethium and mold, and he laid out our extinction timeline like he was discussing weather patterns. Captain Wren, our senior surviving officer, suggested withdrawal to secondary positions, consolidating our defense around the Forge Shrine core. Vrel said no. The Orcs would interpret any withdrawal as weakness and press harder, and we'd lose the outlying districts that provided our observation posts and fields of fire. Wren suggested requesting immediate relief from Sector Command. Vrel said relief fleets were 3 weeks out minimum, and even if they diverted everything not actively engaged elsewhere, we'd be dead or overwhelmed before they arrived. I suggested, because I was new to command and still foolish enough to offer suggestions, that we conduct raids to destroy Orc supply lines and slow their build-up. Vrel looked at me with those grey eyes and said we'd been doing exactly that for 6 months, and the Orcs were still getting stronger, and did I have any other tactically irrelevant ideas I'd like to contribute? The silence in that bunker had a quality I'd never encountered before. It wasn't the silence of fear, exactly. It was the silence of men realizing they're already dead and just haven't stopped moving yet. Captain Wren, who'd survived campaigns on 4 different worlds and had a bionic arm from Armageddon and a face that looked like someone had tried to erase it, asked the question we were all thinking. What did Sector Command say? What were our orders? Vrel smiled, not warmly, and said our orders were to hold Hadris Tertius until relieved or annihilated, whichever came first. Standard Guard doctrine. We'd known this all along, of course, but hearing it stated so baldly, Hearing that our deaths had been filed in triplicate and approved by people who would never see this muddy, miserable world, made it different, made it real. I think that's when Vrel began planning his last order. I can't prove it, but I've had 3 decades to replay those months in my memory, and I can see it now, the way you can sometimes see the shape of a building in scaffolding before the walls go up. He started asking questions, strange ones, about morale, about faith, about how men behaved in the moments before death. He conducted more individual interviews with soldiers from every platoon, just quiet conversations in the trenches or the bunkers, asking about their families, their beliefs, what they thought waited for them after death. Some men found it comforting, like he was a priest instead of a commissar. Others found it deeply disturbing, though they couldn't articulate why. He spent hours with the regimental chaplain, Father Morton, a dried-up old man who'd been preaching the Imperial creed longer than most of us had been alive. What they discussed, I don't know. Father Morton died in the final assault, and Vrel never spoke of it. The Vox signals changed during this period. More frequent, more urgent, but also more precise. Vrel reorganized our communication protocols entirely, implemented new codes, new procedures, new signal disciplines that felt military standard but weren't in any manual I'd ever read. We adapted because Guard soldiers adapt or die, and because Vrel shot anyone who questioned the new procedures. Not angrily. He never displayed anger. He'd explain that standardization was essential for coordinated action, that the new protocols would save lives in the crucial moments of battle, and then he'd execute the questioner for undermining unit cohesion. After the 3rd such execution, we stopped questioning. The Orcs launched their biggest assault yet on day 207. 10,000 greenskins, maybe more, supported by looted Imperial tanks and walkers and enough artillery to crater the landscape. They hit us along a 5-kilometer front, trying to punch through to the Forge Shrine in a single massive push. We held them. Barely. I spent 18 straight hours in a trench that kept collapsing from artillery fire, shooting until my las rifle overheated and I had to swap to a dead man's weapon, shooting until I couldn't hear anything except the ringing in my ears and couldn't see anything except green shapes that needed to die. We killed them in heaps, literally heaps. Bodies stacked like sandbags in front of our positions, and they kept coming, and we kept killing them. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is where we break. This is where mathematics finally catches up to courage. Then I heard it. The Vox click. Triple pulse. Commissariat override. Priority alpha. And Vrel's voice, cutting through the chaos with that impossible clarity, speaking words I didn't understand at first because they seemed so disconnected from reality. He was ordering a general advance, a full regimental assault on the Orc positions. Every able-bodied soldier, every functioning weapon, a coordinated push along the entire front, in the middle of their assault. While they were attacking us, it was suicide. It was insanity. It was exactly what we did, because he was Commissar Vrel, and he did not give orders he did not expect to be obeyed. I learned later that Captain Wren questioned the order for approximately 4 seconds before Vrel shot him through the face, assumed direct command of the regiment, and repeated the order with Wren's blood still steaming in the cold air. By then I was already moving, screaming at my platoon to fix bayonets and prepare to advance, because I understood something the instant I heard that Vox click. Vrel had been planning this, all of it, the new protocols, the reorganization, the conversations, the peculiar attention to detail about who stood where and who could hear what, and how quickly orders would propagate through the command structure. This wasn't desperation. This was design. We went over the top like men from ancient history, like the wars before the Imperium, when humans still fought each other with bayonets and faith, and nothing else. The Orcs, caught mid-assault, confused by the sudden reversal, hesitated for maybe 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds we covered 50 meters. Then they remembered they were Orcs, and they loved this, loved the pure simplicity of close combat, and they surged forward to meet us with that bellowing roar they make that sounds like joy and rage having intercourse. The collision was indescribable. I've participated in 17 close-quarters engagements across my career, and I can tell you about every one of them with tactical clarity, except that one. That one is noise and pressure, and the smell of blood, and the feeling of my bayonet punching through green flesh, and the surprise when an orc's chopper passed so close to my head I felt the wind of it. I killed 4 orcs myself that I'm certain of. Maybe more. The platoon killed dozens. We all did. The entire regiment. 8,000 men suddenly transformed into a single weapon made of screaming and steel. We broke them. Not defeated them. Broke them psychologically. Which shouldn't have been possible because orcs don't break. They retreat, they regroup, they come back, but they don't break. Except they did. The sheer impossibility of it. Human soldiers attacking during their assault. The violation of everything they understood about how fights worked, created a moment of doubt, and that moment propagated through their mob psychology faster than lasfire. And suddenly, they were running. Actually running. I watched orcs throw down weapons and flee toward their own lines with human soldiers in pursuit, and I was among those pursuers, sprinting across ground that had been no man's land for 8 months, hearing Vrel's voice on the Vox directing us like we were pieces on a game board. We took 3 kilometers of orc-held territory in 6 hours. We captured their artillery positions, their supply dumps, their command bunkers. We killed thousands of them, scattered their formations, destroyed their cohesion as a fighting force. By nightfall, what had been an orc war threatening to overrun the planet was a disorganized mob fleeing into the wastes. The Forge Shrine was secure. The Kessock line would hold. Reinforcements, when they arrived, would find a stable situation instead of a desperate last stand. It was a victory. Complete and total. The kind of victory they write about in campaign histories and use as case studies in the Schola Progenium. The cost was acceptable. 4,200 casualties out of 8,000 effectives. 52.5%. Just barely on the acceptable side of Vrel's original projection. Mathematics. The wounded were triaged according to standard protocols. Those who could return to duty got medical attention. Those who couldn't were granted the Emperor's mercy. We spent the night consolidating positions, establishing new defensive lines in territory we'd captured, dealing with the logistics of sudden victory after months of siege mentality. I remember sitting on an orc ammunition crate, drinking water that tasted like rust, and feeling nothing. Not triumph, not relief, not grief for the men I'd lost. Nothing. Just that peculiar numbness that comes after your brain has processed more violence than it was designed to handle. Vrel found me there, appeared out of the smoke and darkness like he always did. He looked exactly the same as when he'd arrived on Hadris Tertius. Not a mark on him, uniform still crisp despite 6 hours of close combat, that stillness about him like the war still couldn't touch him. He sat down next to me on the crate, and we didn't speak for a long time. Around us, the regiment moved through the routines of post-battle, the wounded crying for medics, the exhausted collapsing where they stood, the dead being counted and recorded and stacked like cordwood to await mass burial. The sounds were different than the battle sounds, quieter, more human, somehow worse. Finally, Vrel said, "You did well, Corporal Thane. Your platoon's casualty rate was below the regimental average." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, not sure what I would say if I tried. He continued, "The official reports will say this was a brilliantly executed counteroffensive that shattered the Orc assault and secured the Kessock line. The Lord Commander will probably award the regiment a battle honor. Some of you may even receive commendations." He paused, and I made the mistake of looking at him, meeting those grey eyes. They'd changed. That's what I meant earlier when I said his eyes changed during the last order. They were still grey. Still had that quality of terrible attention, but now there was something else in them, something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been horror, or might have been both. "Would you like to know what really happened, Corporal?" he asked. "The actual mechanics of victory." I should have said no, Every instinct I'd developed in 6 campaigns said this was not a conversation I wanted to have, but I was exhausted and numb, and I'd just survived the impossible, so I nodded. Vrel smiled, and I understood with absolute certainty that this moment had been planned too, that he'd been waiting for this conversation since he arrived on Hadris Tertius. The Orcs were winning, he said. Not tactically. Tactically we were holding, but strategically, mathematically, they were winning because we were running out of everything and they weren't. Standard siege calculus. In 3 weeks we'd have been combat ineffective. In 4 weeks we'd have been corpses. Sector Command knew this. I knew this. The question was how to change the mathematics. He gestured at the captured territory around us. The answer was obvious once you stopped thinking like a defender and started thinking like an actuary. We needed the Orcs to commit everything to a single assault. We needed them to mass their forces in a vulnerable position. We needed them to believe they were about to win, and then we needed them to experience such a profound psychological shock that their entire offensive would collapse. I stared at him. Understanding was beginning to seep into my exhausted brain like poison into a wound. The previous assaults, I said slowly. We were retreating, giving ground, making them think we were weakening. Correct? Vrel said. Controlled retreats, carefully calculated to appear like genuine defensive failure. Captain Wren was excellent at this, very convincing. He actually believed we were losing, which made his tactical decisions authentic. The past tense on Wren's name was delivered without emphasis, just a statement of fact. The Orcs observed a pattern. They attack, we retreat, they gain ground. Simple cause and effect. It encouraged them to commit more forces to each assault, to believe that one more push would break us. And today, I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears, they brought everything they had, everything that mattered, yes. 10,000 Orcs, their best troops, their heaviest weapons, all concentrated on a 5-kilometer front. Perfect target density for the kind of shock assault I'd been training the regiment to execute. He pulled out a data slate, showed me tactical maps with probability curves and casualty projections. I calculated we needed a 52% casualty rate to guarantee victory. Fewer losses, and we wouldn't convince the Orcs of our desperation. More and we'd lack the strength to capitalize on their psychological collapse. 52.5% was the optimal number. As you can see, we achieved precisely that. The numbness was wearing off, replaced by something colder. You planned our losses. Not approximately. Exactly. Exactly as probability allows, yes. Sergeant Voss's squad, for example, had a 68% chance of being wiped out during the initial assault phase, which they were. Lieutenant Cora had an 82% chance of dying in close combat, which he did. You had a 41% survival probability, which is why I spent additional time training your platoon. I needed experienced survivors in specific positions to ensure proper command propagation during the critical phase. He spoke like he was discussing machinery maintenance, like the dead men we were talking about were components that had functioned as designed. The Emperor's will, expressed through mathematics. Corporal. That's what I was listening for during the bombardments. The music of probability, the sound of the God Emperor's plan becoming manifest in trajectory and blast radius and casualty curves. I should have shot him. Looking back, I realized that's what any sane person would have done. Drew my sidearm and put a last round through his skull and damned the consequences. But I was Validian Guard, and he was Commissar, and the Imperium ran on obedience as much as faith. And so I just sat there while he explained how he'd murdered 4,000 men to save a planet, how he'd calculated their deaths down to individual probability percentages, how Wren and Voss and Cora and all the others hadn't died because of Orc violence, but because a Commissar decided their deaths served the Emperor's purpose better than their survival. Why tell me? I finally asked. Why not just file your reports and let everyone believe it was a miracle? Because miracles are dangerous, Corporal. They encourage faith in divine intervention instead of proper discipline. But you're intelligent enough to understand the truth, experienced enough to carry it forward, and he consulted his data slate. You have a 92% probability of surviving the remainder of the campaign and an 87% chance of eventual promotion to officer rank. Someone needs to understand how this victory was actually achieved. Someone needs to carry the lesson forward to the next war and the next regiment. His eyes fixed on mine with that terrible attention. The Emperor's Imperium runs on mathematics, Corporal Thane. Faith and courage are admirable, but they're tactically irrelevant without proper calculation. I'm teaching you how to win wars. Whether you thank me or hate me for it is immaterial. He stood, brushed imaginary dust from his coat, and walked away into the smoke. I sat there for another hour, maybe more, while the regiment continued its post-battle routines around me. The Vox crackled with status reports, supply requests, casualty confirmations. Every transmission started with that triple pulse signal, Commissariat Override, Priority Alpha, and every time I heard it I thought about Vrel explaining probability curves like they were prayers. The relief fleet arrived 18 days later. By then we'd fortified the captured territory, rebuilt our defensive positions, and established such complete dominance over the remaining orcs that they'd fragmented into small bands harrying the wastes. The campaign was officially declared a victory. The 44th Validian received a battle honor. Commissar Vrel was awarded the Order of the Crimson Skull for exceptional leadership under fire. I was promoted to lieutenant to replace Cora. The official reports never mentioned the controlled retreats, the calculated casualties, the mathematical precision of Vrel's plan. They recorded a desperate defensive siege broken by a brilliant counter-offensive, led by an exceptional Commissar, and executed by courageous Imperial Guard soldiers. The Lord Commander himself reviewed the reports and declared Hadris Tertius a model engagement, recommended that Commissar Vrel's tactical innovations be studied at the Schola Progenium. The survivors were dispersed to other regiments as veteran cadre, spreading the glory of the 44th Validian throughout the subsector. Everything was proper. Everything was filed correctly. Everything was a lie built on top of the truth. I couldn't speak without being executed for undermining Imperial morale. I tried once. Drunk on rotgut amasek in a troop transport 3 months after Hadris Tertius, I told Sergeant Hallen what Vrel had explained to me. How our friends hadn't died heroically but mathematically. How the whole thing was calculated murder dressed up as tactics. Hallen listened quietly, nodded, and the next morning reported me to the ship's commissar for spreading defeatist propaganda. I spent 3 days in the brig before Vrel, who'd been assigned to the same transport, intervened. He had me brought to his quarters, which were spartanly furnished, and smelled like old books and gun oil. He didn't say a word about the incident. Instead, he asked if I'd kept count like he'd told me, how many men I'd killed. I said 63, confirmed, probably more. He nodded, said that was adequate progress, and assigned me to his personal staff as an aide. I spent the next 4 years serving under Commissar Vrel across 3 different campaigns, watching him calculate victories, watching him listen to that music of probability only he could hear, watching him transform desperate situations into managed slaughters where the mathematics worked out just right, where casualty projections met reality with disturbing precision. He never explained his methods to me again, never acknowledged that conversation on Hadris Tertius. But he taught me by demonstration, by example, by making me part of the machinery. I learned to read tactical situations the way he did, to see soldiers not as people but as probability curves, to understand that the Imperium couldn't afford sentiment when survival required optimal resource allocation. The worst part, the part that wakes me up 30 years later in this quiet posting where I process requisition forms and pretend to have forgotten how to kill, is that his methods worked. Every campaign we fought under Vrel's command was a victory. Costly victories, yes, but victories nonetheless. Planets held, enemies destroyed, the Emperor's will expressed through mathematics and blood. Other commissars lost regiments to bad luck or orc, cunning or chaos intervention. Vrel lost regiments to equations, and the equations always balanced. He was promoted to Lord Commissar. I was promoted to captain. We were efficient. We were successful. We were monsters who understood that the Imperium needed monsters, that faith alone couldn't hold the darkness back when the darkness had numbers on its side. The last time I saw Vrel was on Morbidia Prime, after a chaos incursion had been contained at a cost of 73% regimental casualties. Acceptable mathematics for facing the ruinous powers. We were standing in the ashes of what had been a cathedral, surrounded by bodies in both Imperial and Chaos colors, and he was explaining to the Lord General how the campaign could have been executed more efficiently, how casualty rates could be optimized for future engagements. The Lord General was looking at Vrel with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself, the slowly dawning horror of understanding how this man thought, what he considered acceptable, but the Lord General couldn't say anything because the mathematics were correct, the planet was held, and questioning a successful Lord Commissar was politically dangerous. After the meeting, Vrel pulled me aside. He looked old. Finally, after all these years. Not tired. Vrel never looked tired, but old, worn down by probabilities. He said, "You've learned well, Captain Thane. You think like an officer now instead of a soldier. That 92% survival probability I calculated on Hadris Tertius was conservative. You've exceeded expectations." I thanked him. "Because what else do you say?" He continued, "I'm being reassigned to the Segmentum Solar. You'll receive your own command. Try to remember that faith and mathematics aren't opposites. They're the same thing expressed in different languages. The Emperor's will is precise. We just have to be willing to calculate it correctly." That was 7 years ago. I received command of the 73rd Validian Mechanized, led them through 2 campaigns with acceptable casualty rates and proper objective completion. Then I made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake, a human one. We were besieging a hive city held by renegades, and I had calculated that we needed to assault through the civilian sectors to avoid the heavier fortifications. The mathematics worked perfectly. We'd lose 38% of our assault force, but we'd take the city. Acceptable. Optimal. The Emperor's will expressed through probability, except one of my junior officers, a young lieutenant who still had that shine in her eyes, asked me about the civilians, how many would die in the crossfire. I told her it was tactically irrelevant, that civilian casualties weren't part of our operational parameters. She looked at me with this expression, this look of slowly dawning horror, and I realized she was looking at me the way I'd looked at Vrel on Hadris Tertius. I called off the assault, found another route, lost more of my own men than the mathematics required, took the city less efficiently. The civilians mostly survived. My casualty rate was 49% instead of 38%. Still acceptable, technically, but the efficiency loss was noted in the after-action reports. I was quietly reassigned to this administratum posting, processing requisition forms for regiments I'll never meet, calculating supply needs for wars I'll never fight. They promoted me to major to soften the blow, gave me a quiet office far from any front line, and let me spend my days filing paperwork and trying to remember what it felt like to think of soldiers as people instead of probability curves. The sound that haunts me isn't the vox click anymore. Not really. It's silence. The silence in Vrel's eyes when he explained how he'd calculated Cora's death. The silence in that young lieutenant's expression when she realized what I'd become. The silence of 4,000 men on Hadris Tertius, who died because a commissar decided their deaths served the Emperor's purpose better than their survival. And they never even knew it. They died believing they were heroes instead of variables in an equation. That silence is louder than any scream, louder than artillery, louder than anything the orcs or chaos or the darkness between stars can produce. Sometimes younger officers come to me for advice, veterans who've heard I served under Lord Commissar Vrel, who want to know the secret of his success. I tell them he listened to the Emperor's will in the sound of shells falling. I tell them he understood that faith and mathematics are the same thing. I tell them he could calculate victory where others saw only defeat. All of this is true. What I don't tell them is the cost. What I don't tell them is that every time I hear a Vox transmission, any Vox transmission, I'm back in that trench listening to Vrel give his last order, the order that saved a planet and killed 4,000 men, and taught me that the Imperium runs on calculations I didn't want to learn, but can't forget. There's a detail I haven't mentioned, a piece of the puzzle I've kept to myself for 3 decades because admitting it would make everything worse. After Morbidia Prime, after Vrel told me about his reassignment to the Segmentum Solar, I did something I shouldn't have. I accessed classified commissariat records through a contact in the Administratum who owed me favors from the war. I wanted to know about Vrel's history, his previous assignments, wanted to understand if Hadris Tertius was an aberration or a pattern. What I found was comprehensive and horrifying. Vrel had been active as a commissar for 41 years. He'd served with 17 different regiments across 9 different sectors. Every single campaign he'd participated in was a victory. Every single one had casualty rates between 47 and 58%. Every single one had after-action reports noting his exceptional tactical leadership, and every single one had a small notation, buried in supplementary documents, about veteran survivors requesting transfer away from units under Vrel's command. The pattern was perfect. Too perfect. The kind of perfection that only comes from deliberate design. I found records of 2 other officers who'd served as Vrel's aides, like I had. One was killed in action 3 months after assignment. The other requested transfer to a penal legion, which is something you do when you'd rather face certain death than continue your current service. I tried to contact him, tracked him down to a prison world where penal legionnaires mine radioactive ore until they die. He was still alive, somehow, 20 years into a posting that usually kills men in 3. I sent a message, asking about Vrel. He sent back a single line. He teaches us to win by becoming what we fight. Then he cut off all communication. I think about that message constantly. What we fight. On Hadris Tertius, we fought orcs. Brutal, simple, cheerfully violent. We beat them by being more brutal, more calculated, by reducing warfare to mathematics colder than anything greenskins could imagine. On Morbidia Prime, we fought chaos cultists who worshipped the dark gods and treated human lives as currency for demonic favor. We beat them by treating human lives as currency for tactical advantage, by calculating death with the precision their dark gods couldn't match. Vrel turned us into mirrors of our enemies, stripped of their weaknesses, optimized for victory. And the worst part, the part that makes the silence loudest, is that it worked. The Imperium needed monsters who could calculate victory, and Vrel made them. Made me. The young lieutenant from the Hive City campaign, the one who looked at me with horror, she was transferred to another unit. I tracked her service record because I needed to know, needed to confirm whether that moment of human decency I showed by calling off the assault actually mattered. She's a colonel now, commanding the 118th Cadian Regiment on the Eastern Fringe. She's won 4 campaigns with casualty rates averaging 32%. Efficient. Successful. Her commendations note her exceptional tactical leadership. I wonder if she thinks about me. I wonder if she's learned the lessons I tried to unlearn by sparing those civilians. I wonder if there's a commissar somewhere teaching her the mathematics of victory, explaining that faith and calculation are the same language. 3 months ago, I received a package. No return address, no identification, just my name and posting in neat script on a standard Administratum parcel. Inside was a data slate containing a single file. Vrel's service record, updated to current. He's dead. Killed in action on a classified operation in the Segmentum Solar, awarded posthumous honors. His body never recovered. The record was dated 2 years ago, which means someone held onto this information for 24 months before sending it to me. The file included 1 additional document, a personal letter written in Vrel's precise handwriting. I'm going to transcribe it here, because I need someone to know, even if this confession never leaves this quiet office, even if it just sits in my personal files until I die and someone erases it unread. Captain Thane, if you are reading this, I am dead. This is not probability, it is certainty. I have calculated my own end with the same precision I applied to every campaign, and the mathematics are quite clear. By the time this reaches you, I will have been dead for precisely 2 years, the amount of time I estimated it would take for the relevant files to be processed through administratum channels and delivered to your current posting. You are wondering why I sent this. The answer is simple: you failed. Not tactically. Your campaigns were adequately successful, but you failed to learn the final lesson, the one I couldn't teach through demonstration alone. You still think of the mathematics as cruel. You still carry guilt for the civilians you should have sacrificed. You still hear screams in the silence instead of the Emperor's will. The truth is this, Captain, and it is the only truth that matters. The Imperium is dying, not today, not tomorrow, but across centuries and millennia, slowly drowning in the rising tide of Xenos and heretics and daemons. Every victory we win is temporary. Every planet we hold will eventually fall. The mathematics are inexorable. We cannot win. We can only delay the inevitable. Buy humanity a few more generations, a few more centuries, if we're very, very efficient. This is why the mathematics matter. This is why faith alone is insufficient. Because when you're fighting a war you cannot win, when you're holding a line that will eventually break, the only thing that matters is how many extra days, extra years, you can calculate from the blood you're willing to spend. I gave the Imperium 41 years of optimal casualty ratios. I bought humanity approximately 217 additional years of survival through campaigns that would have failed under less efficient leadership. That is my legacy. Not the victories, the time. You could have continued this work. You had the intelligence, the training, the experience. Instead, you chose sentiment. You sacrificed efficiency for the comfort of feeling human. This is your failure. And it will cost the Imperium time it cannot afford to lose. But here is the secret I never told you. The one I'm telling you now because I'll be dead and you cannot stop me. I was proud of you for calling off that assault. Proud in a way I could never admit. Proud in a way that would have undermined everything I taught you. Because the Imperium needs monsters who can calculate victory. Yes. But it also needs monsters who remember their monsters, who understand the cost not as abstract numbers, but as human lives, who carry the weight of what we do instead of pretending the mathematics absolve us. I sent you to that administratum posting because you were too valuable to waste and too human to keep on the front lines. Someone needs to remember. Someone needs to carry forward not just the efficiency but the guilt, the understanding that every calculation we make is a sin we commit in the Emperor's name. The Imperium runs on mathematics, Captain, but it survives because some of us still know those mathematics are made of flesh and blood and names we should remember, but don't because there are too many and we're all so very tired. My final order to you is this: survive. Continue your service. Train the next generation of officers when they come to you asking about the secret of victory. Teach them the mathematics if they can bear it. Teach them the guilt if they cannot. Remember that the 4,200 men who died on Hadris Tertius bought humanity years it desperately needed, and remember that this does not make their deaths justified, only necessary. Hold both truths in your mind until they destroy you or transform you into something strong enough to serve despite the weight. The Emperor protects, Captain Thane, but protection requires calculation. Faith requires mathematics. Victory requires sacrifice. And someone has to remember that these things are horrible even when they're correct. Die well, whenever your time comes. I have calculated that you will make captain rank before retirement, will train approximately 87 junior officers over your remaining service period, and will survive to see at least one more major campaign before age or probability catches up to you. Make those numbers count. Commissar Lorenz Vrel, deceased. I burned the data slate after reading the letter. Proper security protocol, and also because I couldn't stand to read it again. But I remember every word, the way I remember the Vox click, the way I remember Cora dying with that chopper in his chest. The way I remember 4,000 variables being optimized for victory on Hadris Tertius. Vrel was right about my survival, wrong about the campaigns. I've seen no combat since Morbidia Prime, but he was right about the training. Young officers come through my posting regularly, bright-eyed believers in the Emperor's protection and the righteousness of Imperial warfare. I teach them logistics, supply chain mathematics, casualty projection models. The ones who are intelligent enough, the ones who have that particular quality of mind that can see people as numbers without losing their humanity entirely, I teach them more, not Vrel's methods, exactly, not the pure calculus of optimized death, but the understanding that warfare is mathematics, that faith requires calculation, that the Imperium survives on efficiency as much as courage, and I teach them to feel guilty about it. That's my addition to Vrel's curriculum, my small rebellion against his perfect equations. I make them understand that every number in their casualty projections was a person, had a name, a history, a family, somewhere who'll receive a death notification in standardized format. I make them carry the weight. Some of them break under it, request transfer to positions where they don't have to think about such things. Others integrate it, become the kind of officers the Imperium needs, efficient enough to win, human enough to hate what winning costs. Last week, a young lieutenant came to my office. She had that shine in her eyes, that belief in miracles and divine intervention. She asked me about Hadris Tertius, said she'd read the campaign history, wanted to know how Commissar Vrel achieved such a brilliant victory against impossible odds. I looked at her, and I heard that vox click in my memory. Triple pulse, commissariat override, priority alpha. I could tell her the truth, the calculations, the controlled retreats, the mathematical precision of mass slaughter, turn her into another monster who understands that the Imperium runs on optimized death. Or I could tell her the lie in the official reports. Let her keep that shine a little longer. Preserve one more officer who still thinks faith alone is sufficient. I compromised. I told her Commissar Vrel listened to the Emperor's will in the sound of falling shells, that he understood warfare as both art and science, that he calculated victory not to replace faith but to express it, that the soldiers who died on Hadris Tertius gave their lives in service to the God Emperor, and their sacrifice bought humanity time it desperately needed. All true. All lies. All the best I could offer her. She saluted, thanked me, left my office with that shine intact. I listened to her footsteps receding down the corridor, and I thought about Vrel's letter, about the 217 years he calculated he'd bought humanity, about the 87 officers he predicted I'd train, about the weight of carrying forward both the mathematics and the guilt, the knowledge and the horror, the efficiency and the cost. Tomorrow there will be another requisition form on my desk, ammunition allocations for a regiment deploying to the Nakmund Gauntlet. I'll calculate their supply needs based on projected casualty rates, enemy force composition, campaign duration estimates. I'll file it properly, ensure the logistics run smoothly, help those distant soldiers stay supplied and effective. The mathematics will be perfect, the equations will balance, and I'll remember that every number represents a person I'll never meet, dying in ways I'll never witness, buying humanity time we'll never be able to repay. The sound that haunts me has changed again. It's not the vox click anymore, not the silence in Vrel's eyes, not the screams of the dying. It's the sound of my own stylus scratching on data slates, calculating death in neat columns and standardized formats. It's the sound of the Imperium's machinery, grinding forward, consuming lives and producing victories, mathematical and efficient, and absolutely necessary, and completely unforgivable. Vrel's last order was to survive and remember, to carry forward the mathematics and the guilt in equal measure, to understand that the Imperium needs both monsters who can calculate victory and monsters who know they're monsters. I've followed that order for 30 years. I'll follow it until I die, or until the Imperium falls, or until the mathematics finally catch up to me. Because that's what we are, those of us who learned Vrel's lessons. We're the calculators in the darkness, the actuaries of atrocity, the mathematicians of necessary evil. We count the cost in lives and years and victories, and we file our reports in proper format, and we train the next generation to carry the same weight we carry. We are what we fight, optimized for efficiency, stripped of illusions, calculating salvation through sacrifice, and in the silence between heartbeats, in the quiet of this administrative office far from any battlefield, I can still hear that vox click, triple pulse, commissariat override, priority alpha, the sound of Vrel's last order echoing down through decades, the sound of 4,000 men dying because the mathematics demanded it, the sound of victory bought with blood and measured in years, terrible and efficient, and the only thing standing between humanity and the darkness that wants to consume us all. The Emperor protects. But protection requires calculation. And someone has to remember that this is horrible even when it's correct. Someone has to carry the weight. Someone has to count the cost and file the reports and teach the next generation and survive with the knowledge of what survival requires. That's me. That's what I became. That's what Vrel's last order made of me. And the worst part, the part that keeps me awake in this quiet posting where I pretend to have forgotten how to kill, is that I'd do it again, given the same choice, the same calculations, the same terrible mathematics of survival. I'd make the same decisions, because the Imperium is dying, and every year we buy it matters, and faith alone isn't enough when the darkness has numbers on its side. The sound that haunts me is my own voice, whispering in the silence. It was necessary. It was horrible. It was both. And I'll carry that truth until probability catches up to me, and I become another number in someone else's casualty calculations, another variable optimized for the Emperor's purpose, another name that should be remembered but won't be because there are too many and we're all so very tired. This is my confession. This is what happened on Hadris Tertius. This is what Commissar Vrel's last order made of me. This is how we win wars in the Imperium of Man.